She was tagged past her prime in front of London's elite. But the Duke, a man who hadn't attended a social function in 3 years, heard every word. That night, he invoked a law forgotten by time and wrote her name beside his own. Not out of charity, not out of duty, but because of what he saw in the pages of her stolen journal. What could possibly be worth risking everything? Hello, dear lovelies. If this tale of love and longing speaks to your heart, I would be deeply grateful for your support, a like, a subscribe, anything that helps me continue bringing you stories of romance and history. And if you feel so inclined, do tell me in the comments where you're reading from. Every message brings such joy to my day. The morning light that crept through the cracked conservatory glass of Jackson House was thin and reluctant, as though it too understood it had no business disturbing the shadows. Karen H. Jackson woke to its timid touch across her face, blinking against the dust motes that danced in the narrow shaft of spring sun, the only luxury her sparse quarters afforded. She rose slowly from the narrow cot, her body protesting the thin mattress that did little against the April chill. The floorboards creaked beneath her bare feet as she crossed to the washstand, where a chipped porcelain basin held water she'd carried up the previous night. It was cold now, biting against her skin as she splashed her face, but Karen had long since stopped expecting warmth. The mirror above the washstand was small and tarnished, its silvering worn away at the edges, so that her reflection seemed to fade into nothing at the periphery. She studied that fading image now, as she did most mornings, cataloguing what she saw with the detached precision of someone conducting an inventory of loss. 29 years old. The thought arrived without particular emotion, simply a fact to be acknowledged, like the weather or the date, April the 14th, 1894. Her dark hair, once her father had said lustrous, now seemed merely brown, practical, unremarkable. The lines at the corners of her eyes that appeared when she smiled, though she smiled rarely these days. The pallor of her skin from too many hours indoors, away from the sun and society that had no use for her, past her prime. The words echoed in her mind, spoken so often by her stepmother, Margaret, and stepsister, Karen V., that they'd worn grooves into her consciousness like water over stone. Too old for marriage, too plain for notice, too poor for prospects. But as Karen met her own gaze in the tarnished mirror, she knew truths they refused to see. She was intelligent, far more educated than Karen V would ever be, thanks to the books her father had left behind. She was capable, managing half the household accounts despite being given no authority. She was kind, or tried to be, even when kindness earned her nothing but more contempt. The world, however, saw only one thing: spinster. She dressed quickly in one of her 2 serviceable gowns, this one a faded grey that had belonged to her mother before consumption had taken her when Karen was barely 12. The fabric was worn soft with age, the hem carefully mended where it had begun to fray. Through the thin walls she could hear the sounds of the main house stirring, the clatter of fine china in the breakfast room, Karen V's laugh, bright and careless as breaking crystal, Margaret's voice, imperious even at this early hour, the sounds of a world that had no place for her except in service to it. Karen descended the narrow back stairs that had once been used by servants before her father's death had transformed her from daughter to dependent, from resident to reluctant charity case. She emerged into the warmth and golden light of the main house. The contrast was immediate and deliberate. Where her converted quarters were all shadows and neglect, the rest of Jackson House gleamed with polished wood and fresh flowers, maintained by the 2 servants Margaret could barely afford but refused to dismiss. Appearances, after all, were everything. The breakfast room was bright with morning sun, the table laden with food Karen had helped cook prepare at dawn but would not be invited to share. Margaret sat at the head in rustling lavender silk, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed despite the early hour. Karen V. lounged beside her, still in her dressing gown, pretty and petulant as a spoiled cat. "There you are," Margaret said without looking up from her correspondence. "The tea has gone cold. Fetch a fresh pot." "Of course." Karen moved to obey, her movements efficient and quiet. "Honestly, Karen, you move like a ghost," Karen V. observed, picking at a pastry with manicured fingers. "It's terribly unnerving, though I suppose at your age one does become rather spectral." "Karen, please," Margaret said, though her tone held amusement rather than censure. "Your stepsister is hardly ancient, merely past marriageable age. There's a difference." Karen's hands trembled slightly as she poured fresh tea, but her face remained carefully blank. She'd learned years ago that reactions only encouraged them. Still, Karen V. continued, warming to her subject. "You'll attend Lady Pemberton's gala with us on Saturday, as my companion, of course." She turned to Karen with an expression of exaggerated sympathy. "Every diamond needs a bit of coal for contrast, don't you think?" "You're too generous, sister dear," Karen replied quietly, the words automatic after years of practice. Margaret finally looked at her, pale blue eyes assessing and cold. "Do try not to embarrass us with that dreadful grey dress. Perhaps stay in the shadows where you belong. Lady Pemberton's events draw the highest society, and we cannot afford complications." The words landed with the weight of long repetition, each one a small stone added to a cairn built over years. Karen stood very still, feeling the familiar ache in her chest not sharp anymore, just a dull, persistent throb like an old wound that never quite healed. "Yes, Margaret," she said, because there was nothing else to say, nothing that would change anything. She was dismissed with a wave, sent to clear dishes the servants should have managed. As she worked, she listened to them discuss preparations fittings for Karen V's new gown, which jewels to wear, which gentlemen might be in attendance. Their voices washed over her like water, necessary as background noise but requiring no real attention. It was only when she'd finished and could finally escape that Karen felt her shoulders drop, the tension easing from her spine as she slipped through the house to the one room that was truly hers. The conservatory had been abandoned for years, its glass panels cracked, its exotic plants long dead and cleared away. But to Karen, it was vast as cathedrals. Weak spring light filtered through the damaged roof, falling across the flagstone floor in patterns of gold and shadow. The air smelled of damp earth and old secrets and possibility. She closed the door behind her and breathed. Here, she could be someone else. Here, the voices that told her she was nothing could be drowned out by silence and creation. Here, she could exist. Karen retrieved her hidden journal from behind, a loose stone in the wall, leather-bound, its pages filled with sketches created from stolen charcoal and scavenged parchment. She settled onto her makeshift stool, an overturned crate, and opened to a fresh page. Her hands moved with practiced confidence, sketching what she'd observed at breakfast. Karen V's beauty marred by the cruel set of her mouth, Margaret's loneliness despite her wealth evident in the way she clutched her correspondence like a lifeline. Karen drew what others overlooked, the truth beneath the performance. "Art reveals truth, Karen. Never forget that." Her father's voice echoed across 5 years of grief. Thomas Jackson had been a gentleman scholar. Teaching her to draw before his sudden death from heart failure had left her at the mercy of his second wife. He'd filled her childhood with pencils and patience, showing her how to see the world not as it pretended to be, but as it truly was. The journal represented her authentic self, the only place she was allowed to exist fully. In its pages, she captured everything she observed but could never possess: beauty, freedom, truth, life unfolding for everyone except her. Each sketch was an act of defiance against invisibility, proof that she still existed even when no one was looking. Karen lost herself in the work, her charcoal moving across the paper, and for a little while she forgot she was past her prime, forgot she was unwanted, forgot she was nothing. In 3 days, Lady Pemberton's gala would change everything, but Karen didn't know that yet. The carriage that delivered them to Lady Pemberton's estate on Saturday evening was cramped and suffocating. Karen sat pressed against the corner, trying to make herself as small as possible in her mother's altered emerald gown. The silk was beautiful, a deep, rich green that caught the fading light, but the style was unmistakably a decade out of fashion, the waist higher than current trends, the sleeves a different shape entirely. Across from her, Karen V was resplendent in pale pink satin, the very latest fashion from Paris, cut to showcase her youth and figure. Seed pearls caught the lamplight like scattered stars, and her golden hair was arranged in elaborate curls that had taken her maid 3 hours to perfect. "Remember," Margaret said as the carriage slowed before the grand entrance, her voice sharp as cut glass, "stand by the terrace doors. Be invisible. Your only purpose tonight is to make Karen shine brighter by comparison." "Yes, Margaret." The words came automatically, worn smooth by repetition. Lady Pemberton's ballroom stole what remained of Karen's breath. It was a symphony of opulence, crystal chandeliers cascading light like waterfalls, walls hung with gilt-framed mirrors that multiplied the brilliance until the entire space seemed to glow. The floor was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the swirl of dancers in their jewel-toned gowns and severe black evening coats. But Karen saw it differently. Through an artist's eye, she observed compositions of light and shadow, the performative nature of every smile and gesture, the careful choreography of society's elaborate pretense. It was all surface, all facade, beautiful and utterly false. She positioned herself near the terrace doors as instructed, watching Karen V take center stage like a practiced performer. Her stepsister held court effortlessly, flirting with various suitors, her laugh bright and musical, drawing admiration like moths to flame. When no one was watching, Karen retrieved her journal from her reticule. Her fingers found the familiar leather binding, and she opened it to a fresh page. The charcoal moved quickly, capturing what she saw. A young debutante's desperate smile as she danced with a gentleman twice her age, an older man standing alone by a column, his loneliness evident in the set of his shoulders. Karen V's hunger for validation barely hidden beneath her beauty. A servant materialized at her elbow with champagne. Karen accepted gratefully, hoping the wine might calm the anxiety that made her hands tremble. She took a long sip, the bubbles sharp against her tongue, and returned to her sketching. She didn't notice Karen V, watching from across the room, pale eyes narrowed with something that looked like jealousy. The attack came without warning. "What have we here?" Karen V's voice rang out, suddenly beside her. Before Karen could react, her stepsister snatched the journal from her hands with champagne-emboldened boldness. "Look at what our resident spinster does with her time." Karen's stomach dropped. "Please, give that back." But Karen V was already flipping through the pages, holding sketches up for the gathering crowd. Playing artist like a child. How utterly pathetic. Laughter rippled through the assembled guests as the journal passed from hand to hand. Karen's private world, her authentic self, exposed and mocked. She watched in horror as her drawings circulated intimate observations transformed into entertainment, truth twisted into ridicule. "She's past her prime," Karen V announced to the crowd, her voice carrying across the ballroom with devastating clarity. 29 years old, and desperately clinging to fantasy. Pathetic, really. The words landed like blows. Karen pushed forward, trying to retrieve her journal, but the crowd seemed to close ranks against her. Faces she didn't know laughed at her most private thoughts. Hands passed her sketches around like amusing curiosities. Her humiliation was complete, total, burning through her like fire. "Please," she whispered, hating the desperation in her voice. "Please give it back." The laughter swelled and then stopped. Absolute silence fell like a curtain dropping. The crowd shifted, parting with the unconscious deference reserved for true power. Karen looked up through tears. She refused to let fall and saw a man she'd never seen before, moving through the assembled guests with quiet, devastating authority. He was tall, dressed entirely in black like a figure from a mourning portrait. Dark hair, severe features, an expression of controlled intensity that made the air around him feel charged. Everything about him spoke of power held in rigid check, the precise way he moved, the careful neutrality of his expression, the cold authority in his dark eyes as they swept across the scene. Whispers started immediately, racing through the crowd like wildfire. "The Duke of Ashmont hasn't been seen in society since his wife's death. 3 years he's been in seclusion. What is he doing here?" The Duke reached the epicenter of Karen's humiliation and extended his hand. Wordlessly, the gentleman holding her journal surrendered it, practically bowing as he did so. No one dared refuse. The ballroom held its collective breath as the Duke opened the journal. His eyes moved across the sketches with absolute focus, studying each page with the intensity of someone examining priceless artifacts. The silence stretched, became unbearable. Karen felt her face burning, certain he was cataloguing her inadequacy, her presumption, her pathetic attempts at art. Then his eyes lifted from the pages and found her across the room, not with pity, not with mockery, with something intense and unreadable that made her breath catch and her heart hammer against her ribs. He looked at her as though he could see straight through to her soul, as though the sketches had revealed something he recognized, something he'd been searching for. The moment stretched, impossible and electric. Then he did something no one expected. He smiled. The Duke's smile vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by that mask of controlled authority. He closed the journal with deliberate care and turned to address the assembled crowd, his voice carrying effortlessly across the silent ballroom. "These works demonstrate extraordinary talent," he said, each word precise and final. "Who is the artist?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Karen felt every eye in the room turn toward her, but before she could speak, Karen V stepped forward with a practiced curtsy. "Your Grace, No." The single word cut through her attempted claim like a blade. The Duke's gaze settled on Karen V with something that might have been contempt. "Liars have a particular quality to their bearing. You lack it entirely." Karen V went pale, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Humiliated murmurs rippled through the crowd, the same crowd that had been laughing at Karen moments before, now turning their mockery toward her stepsister. "I'll ask once more," the Duke said, his dark eyes scanning the ballroom. "Who created these sketches?" Karen's legs felt like water, but years of being invisible had taught her something about courage born of desperation. She stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying in the absolute silence. "They're mine, Your Grace." His attention fixed on her with that same intense focus, and Karen felt stripped bare under his scrutiny. He studied her the way he'd studied her sketches, as though cataloguing every detail, every truth she'd tried to hide. "You see what others overlook," he said finally. "Not a question, a statement, rare, valuable." He moved toward her, and the crowd parted once more. When he reached her, he held out the journal. Karen took it with trembling hands, clutching it against her chest like a shield. "Consider this alone," the Duke continued, his voice quieter now, meant only for her. "I'll be calling on you tomorrow to discuss patronage." Before Karen could respond, before she could even process what was happening, he turned and walked toward the ballroom's exit with that same controlled grace. The crowd remained frozen, too shocked to even whisper, until he disappeared through the doors. Then the ballroom erupted. The carriage ride home was a nightmare of Margaret's fury and Karen V's venomous silence. Karen sat pressed into her corner, the journal clutched in her lap, while her stepmother's questions rained down like blows. "What did you do? What scheme is this? How did you even know the Duke would be there?" "I didn't. Don't lie to me. The Duke of Ashmont hasn't attended a social function in 3 years, and suddenly he appears at the very event where you've—" Margaret's voice cracked with barely controlled rage. "What did you promise him?" "Nothing. I've never even seen him before tonight." But Margaret wasn't listening, already calculating, already planning how to turn this unexpected development to the family's advantage. Karen V stared out the window, her pretty face twisted with something ugly and wounded. Karen barely slept that night, lying awake in her narrow cot as dawn crept through the cracked glass. The Duke's words circled endlessly through her mind. Patronage. What did that mean? Was this some elaborate mockery? Pity for the pathetic spinster? Or had he truly seen something in her work? The official ducal carriage arrived at precisely 10 o'clock the next morning, black and imposing, bearing the Ashmont crest in silver on its doors. A footman in immaculate livery presented a sealed letter to Margaret, who'd intercepted him at the door. Karen watched from the stairs as her stepmother read, her face cycling through shock, calculation, and something that might have been greedy triumph. "You're summoned to Ashmont Hall," Margaret said, looking up at Karen with eyes like ice. "Immediately. I don't understand." "You will not embarrass this family." Margaret's voice was sharp enough to cut. "Whatever the Duke wants, you will be grateful and compliant. Do you understand me?" Karen V appeared in the doorway of the breakfast room, still in her dressing gown, her face pale and pinched. "He pities you," she said, her voice dripping venom. "That's all this is. When he realizes what you truly are, a talentless nobody playing at art, he'll regret wasting his time." But beneath the cruelty, Karen heard fear. For the first time in her life, she had something Karen Veef wanted. The realization was dizzying. The journey to Ashmont Hall passed in a blur of anxiety and impossible hope warring in Karen's chest. When the estate came into view, her breath caught. It was massive, imposing, a monument to wealth and power that made Jackson House look like a cottage. The grounds stretched to the horizon, perfectly maintained, and the house itself was classical perfection, all clean lines and perfect proportions. The butler who greeted her did so with a respectful bow that shocked her into silence. She was used to being invisible to servants, beneath notice. But here, she was treated like someone who mattered. "Miss Jackson, His Grace is expecting you. If you'll follow me." He led her through galleries that made her artist soul ache with longing. Renaissance masterpieces lined the walls, works she'd only seen in books. Caravaggio, Titian, Raphael, the wealth represented here was staggering, incomprehensible. The Duke awaited in his study, surrounded by acquisition ledgers and art catalogues, standing before a window that overlooked his vast estate. He turned as she entered, and that intense gaze settled on her once more. "Miss Jackson, thank you for coming." "Your Grace," Karen curtsied, her heart hammering. "I confess I don't understand why I'm here." He moved to his desk, retrieving a document bound in official seals. "I'm invoking the matrimonial decree of artistic patronage, an 18th century law allowing nobility to claim an artist as spouse for the purpose of preserving national artistic heritage." The words made no sense. Karen stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "I beg your pardon? It's archaic but still legally binding. The decree allows me to claim you as my intended bride." His voice was matter-of-fact, as though discussing a business transaction. "For the preservation of your artistic talent. You can't be serious." Karen's voice rose despite her best efforts at composure. "Your Grace, we've spoken perhaps 10 words total. You know nothing about me. I've seen 100 of your truths." He held up the document. "Words are often lies, Miss Jackson. Art rarely is. Your sketches revealed more about you than 1,000 conversations could." He placed the decree on the desk between them. Karen could see official signatures, magistrate seals, legal terminology that made her head spin. "This has already been approved by the necessary authorities. You'll be the Duchess of Ashmont by week's end." Karen stared at the document that would change her life forever, unable to decide if this was salvation or simply a different kind of prison. The guest suite they gave Karen was 3 times the size of the entire servants' wing at Jackson House. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked manicured gardens that seemed to stretch into infinity. The bed was canopied in silk the color of cream, the wardrobe already filled with gowns a modiste had delivered that very afternoon. A writing desk sat positioned to catch the morning light, equipped with proper drawing paper, charcoal, even paints she'd only dreamed of touching. It was beautiful. It was overwhelming. It felt like a gilded cage. Karen spent her first evening exploring Ashmont Hall, like a ghost haunting someone else's life. Gallery after gallery revealed itself, Renaissance masters, Baroque portraits, modern works from artists whose names she'd only read in journals. The wealth represented here was incomprehensible, and somehow she was meant to belong in the middle of it. The servants treated her with a respect that felt foreign and deeply uncomfortable. They curtsied when she passed, addressed her as Miss Jackson with genuine deference, asked if she needed anything with what seemed like authentic concern. She was used to being invisible, beneath notice. This attention made her skin crawl with anxiety. She was passing through a corridor near the kitchens when she heard voices, servants speaking in hushed tones that carried through an open doorway. "Can't believe His Grace is taking another wife, after what happened with the late Duchess. Tragic, that was. Such a celebrated artist. And then, hush, you know he doesn't allow talk of it. Been half dead himself since it happened, locked away in this house like a tomb. 3 years of mourning, now this sudden marriage to a stranger. Mark my words, no good will come of it." Karen pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering. The late Duchess, celebrated artist, tragic death. The pieces were assembling into a picture she didn't want to see. Why would a grieving widower suddenly claim a stranger as his bride? She found the locked studio the next morning while exploring the 3rd floor. It was at the end of a long corridor, separate from the other rooms. Its door different from the rest, heavier, darker, with a lock that looked recently maintained despite the dust gathering on the threshold. Karen tried the handle instinctively. Locked. I wouldn't miss. She jumped, spinning to find an elderly maid watching her with worried eyes. The woman was perhaps 60, her face kind but careworn, her hands twisted with age. "I'm sorry. I was just—" "That was the late Duchess Isabel's sanctuary," the maid said, moving closer with the careful steps of someone whose joints ached. "His Grace has forbidden anyone entry since her death. Even the cleaning staff aren't permitted." Karen's curiosity sharpened into something more urgent. What happened to her? The maid, Mrs. Hemsworth, Karen remembered from introductions, glanced down the corridor as though checking for listeners. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "She was a celebrated artist, miss. Galleries across Europe displayed her portraits. Royalty commissioned her work. She was brilliant, they said." A pause, heavy with meaning. "But fame is heavy, miss. Some can't bear the weight of it." The implication hung between them like smoke. Karen's stomach twisted. She took her own life? Mrs. Hemsworth's silence was answer enough. 3 years ago this spring, the elderly maid continued quietly. His Grace found her in that studio. He locked it that very day and hasn't opened it since. Some doors are better left closed, miss. Karen stared at the locked door, her mind racing. A celebrated artist wife who'd killed herself. A duke who'd locked himself away in mourning. And now, suddenly, another artist claimed as his bride. And he wants to replace her with me? The words escaped before she could stop them, horror and understanding colliding in her chest. Mrs. Hemsworth touched her arm gently. I couldn't say, miss, but His Grace. He's not been right since it happened. Whatever his reasons, I'd tread carefully. Karen didn't tread carefully. She stormed into the Duke's study without knocking, fury overcoming the years of conditioning that had taught her to be small and quiet and invisible. He looked up from his desk, surprise flickering across his controlled features. Miss Jackson, am I your penance? The words burst out of her like a dam breaking. Are you trying to resurrect her through me? Replace what you lost with some poor substitute you can control this time. The Duke stood slowly, his expression going cold and closed. You know nothing about my wife. I know you've locked her away like a shrine. Karen advanced into the room, her hands shaking but her voice steady with righteous anger. I know you haven't attended society in 3 years. I know you saw my sketches and suddenly decided to claim a stranger as your bride. I won't be a ghost's replacement. I won't fill a dead woman's place just because you're too broken to move forward. Something cracked in his facade. The careful control shattered, and for the first time, she saw real emotion break through. You're nothing like Isabel. The words came out harsh, almost violent. Nothing. Karen stopped, shocked by the vehemence in his voice. The Duke turned away, his hands bracing against his desk as though he needed the support. When he spoke again, his voice was raw, stripped of artifice. Isabel's portraits were technically perfect, flawless, every brushstroke precise, every composition balanced. Society celebrated her as a genius. He laughed, bitter and broken. I felt nothing looking at her work, nothing looking at her. Our marriage was duty, performance, two people going through the motions of what was expected. He turned back to face her, and the anguish in his eyes made Karen's breath catch. Your sketches made me feel for the first time in years, perhaps for the first time ever. His voice dropped to something almost reverent. You draw truth, Miss Jackson, raw, uncomfortable, beautiful truth. That's worth more than 1,000 celebrated portraits. That's worth everything. Karen stood frozen, all her fury draining away into something more complicated, understanding mixed with fear, mixed with something she didn't dare name. I need time, she said finally, her voice shaking. And I need to see that studio. If I'm meant to live in this house, I won't have locked doors and forbidden secrets hanging over me. That room is off limits. The coldness returned to his voice like a door slamming shut. Then this arrangement is too. Karen met his eyes steadily despite the fear making her hands tremble. I won't marry a man who keeps that many secrets. I won't spend my life wondering what truths you're hiding behind locked doors. The silence stretched between them, taut as a wire about to snap. The Duke stared at her, and Karen stared back, neither willing to bend. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet and final as a judge's verdict. You may have 3 days to decide, Miss Jackson. Stay or leave. But that door remains locked. Karen left the study with her heart pounding and her future more uncertain than ever. Karen spent the next morning in the East Gallery, standing before a massive Caravaggio that dominated the wall. The dramatic use of light and shadow chiaroscuro, her father had called it, drew her in completely. She was so absorbed she didn't hear the Duke approach until he spoke. The Taking of Christ, 1602, commissioned by the Mattei family in Rome. Karen didn't turn, still studying the painting. He's terrified. Who? Judas. She pointed to the figure reaching toward Christ. Everyone sees the betrayal, the kiss, but look at his eyes. He's terrified of what he's doing. Caravaggio painted the moment of choice the instant before the betrayal becomes irreversible. Silence. Then the Duke moved closer, studying the painting with new attention. I've owned this piece for 5 years. I never saw that. Most people don't look past the obvious narrative. Karen finally glanced at him. Art isn't just about what's depicted. It's about what's felt. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but a softening. Isabel would catalogue facts about this painting. Date, provenance, technique. You find souls. They moved through the gallery together after that, the tension between them easing into something tentative and genuine. The Duke shared stories of acquisitions, and Karen pointed out emotional subtexts he'd never noticed. For the first time since arriving at Ashmont Hall, she felt almost comfortable. That afternoon, a servant delivered an enormous crate to her suite. Inside, oil paints from Paris, canvases of the finest linen, brushes made from sable hair, pigments in colors she'd only dreamed of using. The Duke appeared in her doorway as she stood overwhelmed before the supplies. "You can't prove your talent with charcoal alone. You'll need proper materials." Karen turned to him, gratitude and wariness warring in her chest. "Your Grace, this is too much." "It's not enough." His voice was quiet, almost sad. "It will never be enough to undo what you've suffered. But perhaps it's a beginning." The fragile trust shattered the next morning when Mr. Wickham arrived. He was a London art dealer, thin and sharp-featured, dressed in expensive but slightly worn clothing. Behind him came Margaret and Karen V, both wearing expressions of vindictive triumph, barely masked by false concern. Karen was in the main drawing room when they invaded, the Duke summoned from his study by an agitated butler. She watched in growing horror as Wickham spread documents across the table, photographs of sketches, provenance papers, damning comparisons. "Your Grace, I'm afraid I bring troubling news." Wickham's voice was oily with false regret. "Miss Jackson's work appears to be traced copies of obscure European artists. These Italian sketches predate her work by decades." He presented side-by-side comparisons, compositions remarkably similar to Karen's, figures in nearly identical poses. The evidence looked damning. "I tried to warn you, Your Grace," Karen V said, her voice dripping false sympathy. "My stepsister has always been deceptive about her abilities." Margaret stepped forward, her expression painted with maternal concern that made Karen's stomach turn. "We'd hoped she'd outgrown such tendencies. As a child, she was caught copying her father's work and claiming it as her own. We thought perhaps she'd learned honesty, but—" "That's a lie," Karen's voice cracked. Father taught me to draw, but I never claimed his work as mine." "Of course you deny it." Karen V's smile was poisonous. "You've always been skilled at deception, haven't you? Probably how you trapped His Grace into this absurd arrangement." Karen felt the room tilting, her vision blurring with tears she refused to shed. The evidence looked convincing. What if they were right? What if everything she'd created was simply derivative, copied unconsciously from things she'd seen in her father's books? The Duke's voice cut through her spiral like a blade. "Evidence can be manufactured, Mr. Wickham. Photographs altered, provenance forged. I've seen it done before in the art world." Wickham bristled. "Your Grace, I assure you. I need proof." The Duke's tone could have frozen water. "Miss Jackson will create original works in front of witnesses within 48 hours. If her talent is authentic, it will prove itself. If not—" He paused, and Karen felt her heart stop. "Then this arrangement will be dissolved." After they left, Karen fled to the gardens, collapsing onto a stone bench as the tears finally came. The Duke found her there, shaking with sobs she couldn't control. "What if they're right?" The words tore out of her. "What if I'm just a talented copyist? What if everything I create is derivative, unconsciously traced from things I've seen? What if I'm nothing but a fraud?" The Duke sat beside her, not touching but present. When he spoke, his voice was raw with something that sounded like pain. "My father pressured me into marrying Isabel. She was celebrated, famous, and he wanted that fame attached to the Ashmont name. I was 25 and too dutiful to refuse." He stared at his hands. "Our marriage was cold. She created for galleries and public acclaim. I collected art for prestige. We performed our roles perfectly." Karen looked up, tears still streaming down her face. "I never saw her suffering until it was too late." She left a note after. His voice caught. Just 2 words. Never enough. She'd spent her life trying to be enough for everyone, her patrons, society, me, and she'd failed, or thought she had. "I'm sorry," Karen whispered. "I failed to see her because I was trained to value accomplishment over humanity, to see art as acquisition rather than soul." He finally met her eyes. "You've taught me the difference. Your sketches aren't valuable because they're technically perfect. They're valuable because they're human, real, true." "Then why claim me?" The question burst out. "Why risk your reputation on someone society deems worthless?" His answer was immediate and fierce. "Because accomplishment without humanity is worthless, and you have more humanity in one sketch than all of London's celebrated artists combined." That's worth everything. Karen felt something crack open in her chest, not breaking, but opening. I'll prove my work is mine, she said, her voice steadying. Not for them, for me. The Duke stood and offered his hand to help her rise. When their fingers touched, electricity sparked between them, undeniable, impossible, terrifying. Their eyes met and held. Neither acknowledged it aloud, but something had shifted irreversibly between them. The gallery room felt like an execution chamber. Witnesses lined the walls, art critics with skeptical expressions, 3 members of the Royal Academy, society figures who'd come to watch either a vindication or a scandal. In the corner, Margaret and Karen V sat with Mr. Wickham, wearing expressions of anticipated triumph. Karen stood before 3 blank canvases, her hands trembling as she selected her first brush. 6 hours to create 3 original works, 6 hours to prove she wasn't a fraud, wasn't a copyist, wasn't everything they'd said she was. Performing art felt like betraying its intimacy. Art was meant to be private, honest, a conversation between soul and canvas. This felt like vivisection, her creative process dissected under hostile eyes. Across the room, the Duke stood perfectly still, his dark eyes steady on her, not commanding, not directing, simply believing. That unwavering faith steadied her shaking hands more than any words could have. Karen closed her eyes, took a breath, and began. The first portrait was of Mrs. Hemsworth. Karen painted from memory the elderly maid's weathered face, her work-twisted hands, but more than that, the dignity hidden beneath years of service, the dreams abandoned for survival, the quiet strength of invisible labor. Every brushstroke was an act of seeing, of honoring what society overlooked. The witnesses murmured as the painting took shape, but Karen barely heard them. She was lost in the work, in the truth she was making visible. The second piece, Ashmont Hall's gardens as she'd seen them during her breakdown, but painted with the emotional weight of memory and longing. Not just hedges and flowers, but sanctuary and prison intertwined, beauty that both sheltered and confined. The landscape of her confusion made tangible. 4 hours had passed. Karen's shoulders ached, her eyes burned from concentration. 1 canvas remained. She hesitated before it, brush poised, heart hammering. Then she looked across the room at the Duke, and she knew what she had to paint. The witnesses fell absolutely silent as Karen began the third portrait. She painted the Duke not as society saw him, not the cold, controlled aristocrat, not the grieving widower locked away in mourning. She painted the man she'd glimpsed in fragments over these strange days, the guilt he carried like stones in his pockets, the grief that had calcified around his heart, the carefully hidden hope that her presence had awakened despite his best efforts to remain numb. The vulnerability in the piece was devastating. Every brushstroke revealed something he'd tried to hide, the loneliness, the self-recrimination, the desperate fear of failing again, but also tentatively, barely visible, the possibility of healing. Hours passed like heartbeats. Karen's entire world narrowed to canvas and paint and truth. The witnesses watched in absolute silence, even the skeptics drawn into the raw honesty emerging from her brush. When she finally stepped back, exhausted and trembling, the painting was complete. Not technically perfect, she could see flaws in the proportions, places where her inexperience showed, but it was devastatingly, undeniably true. Mr. Wickham stared at the portrait, his face pale. Even he couldn't deny what was obvious. This could only come from someone who truly saw, who painted not surfaces but souls. Karen V lunged forward, her voice shrill with desperation. Anyone can paint emotion. It doesn't prove originality. It proves everything. The Duke's voice cut through her protest like a blade. He moved toward the portrait, his eyes fixed on his own painted face with an expression Karen couldn't read. My wife painted me dozens of times. Gallery pieces, celebrated portraits. She never once looked past the title to find the man. He turned to Karen, and something in his gaze made her breath catch. Miss Jackson has painted someone I barely recognize as myself, but it's the truest portrait I've ever seen. The Royal Academy representatives moved closer, studying all 3 works with the careful attention of professionals. The eldest, a gentleman with silver hair and sharp eyes, finally spoke. These works are unquestionably original. The technique is raw, untrained in places, but the emotional honesty is extraordinary. No copyist could create this. This comes from genuine artistic vision. Mr. Wickham made a sound like a trapped animal. Under the weight of the Duke's cold stare, the truth came spilling out. The evidence was fabricated. Miss Carr paid me to create false documentation, to find sketches that could be claimed as source material. The compositions were similar by chance. Not copying. I needed the money, and she was very persuasive. "Get out!" The Duke's voice was arctic. "All of you, out of my house. If you ever approach Miss Jackson or this estate again, I will destroy you socially and financially. Do you understand?" Margaret stood, her face a mask of fury and humiliation. Karen V was crying tears of rage, not remorse. As servants escorted them out, her stepsister's final look was pure venom. But Karen felt no triumph, only exhaustion and the terrifying realization of what she'd done. She'd exposed the Duke's innermost self to public scrutiny, painted his vulnerabilities for strangers to see. He'd called it true, but truth could wound as surely as lies. The witnesses departed, murmuring amongst themselves. The Royal Academy representatives congratulated her, and then, finally, she was alone in the gallery with her paintings and her racing heart. Karen fled. She made it to her suite and collapsed onto the bed, shaking with reaction. What had she done? What had she revealed? The intimacy of that portrait felt like a violation now. In retrospect, she'd stripped him bare on canvas, and he'd thanked her for it. But a knock at the door. Soft, tentative. "Miss Jackson," the Duke's voice, careful and uncertain in a way she'd never heard. "May I come in?" Karen sat up, her heart in her throat, and whispered, "Yes." He entered without pretense, closing the door behind him with careful quietness. The Duke looked diminished somehow, stripped of the armor he wore so naturally. In the lamplight, Karen could see the exhaustion around his eyes, the vulnerability her portrait had captured so accurately it made her chest ache. "You painted what no one else has ever seen," he said quietly, "and I need you to see something in return." They walked through silent corridors, past empty rooms and shuttered windows. The house felt different at night, less like a monument, more like a confession. He stopped before an unmarked door at the end of the east wing. "I locked this 3 years ago." His hand rested on the handle but didn't turn it. "After the funeral, I couldn't." He stopped, gathering himself. "You said you needed to see it. See it." The door swung open. Karen stepped into a shrine. Isabel's studio was preserved with archaeological precision brushes, laid out in perfect rows, pigments organized by hue, unfinished canvases positioned exactly as she'd left them in 1892. But it was the walls that stole Karen's breath. Portraits, dozens of them. The Duke in formal dress, in riding clothes, in evening wear. Each technically flawless, the proportions mathematically precise, the lighting gallery perfect, the brushwork confident and skilled, and each completely, devastatingly hollow. They were portraits of a title, not a man. Surface without depth. Duty without devotion. Karen moved through them slowly, seeing the artistic skill, recognizing the emptiness. Then she found it, the final portrait, half-finished, with the Duke's eyes violently scratched out, deep gouges through the canvas where his gaze should have been. "She couldn't see you," Karen whispered, her fingers hovering above the ruined canvas. "She painted your face 100 times and never once looked into your eyes." The Duke stood very still behind her. "I thought if I gave her everything, time, materials, freedom from all duties, that would be enough. I was wrong. She needed something I couldn't name, something I failed to." Voices erupted from downstairs, angry, familiar voices cutting through the house's silence. "Don't care what your servants say. We have legal grounds." Margaret's voice, sharp with authority. Karen V's, following, higher-pitched and venomous. The Duke moved toward the door, but Karen caught his arm. "Let them come," she said quietly. "I'm tired of running." They appeared in the doorway moments later, Margaret imposing in burgundy silk, Karen V, flushed and triumphant behind her. Both stopped short at the sight of the studio, at Karen standing among the dead wife's preserved works. "How fitting," Margaret said, recovering quickly. "Standing in a shrine to your betters, surrounded by real art." She withdrew papers from her reticule. "That journal and all sketches are household property. Created under our roof, they belong to us." Karen V stepped forward, her smile cruel. "Legal documents. Everything you made while living as our charity case belongs to the household. You'll sign over ownership now, then return to your proper place. You've always been nothing. We made you useful." Margaret moved closer, and for the first time, Karen saw past the cruelty to the wound beneath. "I was 17 when I painted my first portrait," 17 when my father burned my canvases and arranged my marriage to a wool merchant. Her voice was bitter with old poison. But my daughter would achieve what I couldn't, until you and your pathetic scribbles, understanding, crashed over Karen. You weren't trying to stop me. You were trying to stop yourself from watching me live the life you never had. Sign the papers. Margaret's mask cracked, showing desperation underneath. Sign them, or we'll sue for everything. We'll destroy your reputation permanently. You'll never paint again. The Duke stepped forward, producing his own documents with glacial precision. Any work created under coercion has no legal standing. These papers grant Miss Jackson complete ownership of all works past and future. He handed them to Karen, then produced a second set. And these are the plans for a private studio being built in the East Gardens. Fully equipped, entirely separate from the main house. He turned to Karen, and his voice softened. Unlike my treatment of Isabel, I'm giving you space that's yours alone. Not for me, not for society, for you. Karen looked at the scratched-out portrait, at Isabel's perfect hollow paintings, at Margaret's twisted face. Understanding crystallized. She scratched out your eyes because she'd never looked into them, Karen said to the Duke. She could only see the title, the expectation, the duty you represented. She turned to Margaret and Karen V, finding her voice not defensive, not apologetic, but clear and true. I've spent 29 years being invisible. He saw my art before he saw me, and I thought that diminished me, that I was only valuable for what I could create. But maybe being seen for the truth we offer is the deepest form of being seen. She looked at the Duke. You don't want me despite my art. You want me because of it, because art is soul-made visible. The Duke reached into his pocket and withdrew 2 keys, one antique brass, one newly minted silver. I can't undo my failure with Isabel, but I promise you what I never gave her. Permission to be imperfect, to be honest, to create art that's flawed and real. He held out both keys, one for this studio, one for the new one. Choose which is yours, or choose neither and leave, but choose for yourself. Karen took both keys, feeling their weight in her palm. I'll honor her memory by finishing what she couldn't, finding perfection in imperfection. She met his gaze steadily. And I choose you, not as patron or savior or penance, but as the first person who looked at my work and saw my soul. Margaret made a sound of fury, but the Duke's cold stare silenced her. Leave my house, now, and never return. As they were escorted out, Karen stood in Isabel's shrine holding 2 keys to 2 futures, and for the first time in 29 years, chose her own path forward. The transformation took 3 weeks. Karen dismantled Isabel's shrine methodically, reverently. She packed away the perfect brushes, donated unopened pigments to young artists, moved the hollow portraits to storage. The studio breathed differently once freed from its museum. Stillness air moved through open windows. Sunlight touched surfaces that had been darkened for 3 years. She stood before the scratched-out portrait, studying the violence of those gouges. Then she began to paint. She didn't restore the ruined eyes. Instead, she completed them anew, painting in depths Isabel had never attempted. Eyes that showed grief, yes, but also capacity for joy. Eyes that could see beyond duty to the soul beneath. The Duke came to watch her work sometimes, standing silent in the doorway, his expression unreadable. When she finished, she turned to him. Is it presumptuous, completing her work? Is it true? He asked quietly. She studied the portrait the Duke as Isabel might have painted him if she'd ever truly looked. Yes, then it's not presumptuous, it's generous. Karen created 7 more pieces over those 3 weeks. A self-portrait showing herself not invisible but radiant with presence, meeting the viewer's gaze directly. The Duke again, but this time showing his grief, transforming into tentative hope, winter ice beginning to thaw. Mrs. Hemsworth in her Sunday dress, dignity acknowledged, the gardens not as prison but as possibility. And the controversial pieces, portraits of Margaret and Karen V. She painted them with technical perfection that would have made Isabel proud. But the perfection revealed rather than concealed Margaret's crushed artistic soul visible beneath her cruelty, the frightened girl under Karen V's viciousness. Every flaw they tried to hide made luminous, fear, insecurity, pain that had calcified into malice. The Duke found her standing before these portraits the night before the exhibition, her hands trembling. They'll never forgive me for this, she said quietly, seeing them this clearly, showing what they hide. He moved beside her, studying the paintings with careful attention. Is it true? Devastatingly. Then you owe them nothing but honesty. Truth doesn't require forgiveness. The exhibition opened on a cold afternoon in late October, 1895. Society arrived, expecting scandal, prepared to judge, eager for spectacle. They found transformation instead. The gallery room revealed Karen's journey through 8 portraits, each one a study in seeing clearly. Guests moved through in absolute silence, the usual murmur of social performance absent. Even hardened critics stood motionless before the raw emotional honesty, several blinking back tears they'd never admit to later. Karen V stopped before her own portrait and crumpled. She stood there for long minutes, staring at the frightened girl Karen had painted. Beneath the cruelty, the desperate need for validation, the fear of never being enough, the love she'd never received made visible in every brushstroke. When she finally turned away, her face was wet. Margaret stood frozen before her portrait for so long that guests began to whisper. Karen had painted her young 17, the age she'd mentioned, holding brushes her father would soon burn. The soul of an artist crushed by duty, living vicarious dreams through a daughter who could never fulfill them. Pain made visible, loss acknowledged. "I hated you," Margaret said quietly, not looking at Karen, "because you were brave enough to be what I couldn't." She walked out without another word, but something in her posture had changed. Defeat, perhaps, or possibly the first hint of liberation. The Royal Academy representative, the same silver-haired gentleman who'd validated her work during the proof, moved through the exhibition twice before speaking. "This is what art should be," he said finally. "Truth that transforms both artist and observer. Miss Jackson doesn't paint surfaces, she paints souls." The ceremony took place 3 days later in Ashmont Hall's private chapel. Society attended, but the atmosphere felt different, genuine witnesses rather than judges, people who'd been transformed by seeing clearly. The chapel was intimate, lit by afternoon sun through stained glass, filled with autumn flowers from the gardens Karen had once painted as prison. The Duke stood at the altar in formal dress, but there were paint stains on his cuffs. He'd been helping her prepare canvases that morning. Karen wore ivory silk with her grandmother's lace, and her hands bore traces of burnt umber she hadn't quite scrubbed away. When the priest nodded for vows, the Duke's voice was steady but not formal, genuine emotion rather than practiced performance. "I promise to never confuse accomplishment with worth, to see you always as you are, extraordinary and human and true. Truth at first sketch, you drew me as I was, grief and all, and didn't look away. I promise to never look away from you." Karen's voice trembled but held. "I promise to never hide my vision to make others comfortable, to see you with the same fierce honesty you've granted me. I promise to honor what we create together, art and life intertwined, imperfect and real." The priest pronounced them married, and the Duke kissed her not with aristocratic reserve but with genuine hunger, 3 years of numbness breaking apart, winter finally ending. When they turned to face their witnesses, Karen's hand clasped firmly in his. Several guests noticed the paint stains beneath their formal gloves. Artists first, aristocrats second. The reception spilled into the gardens, as sunset painted the sky in shades Karen would later try to capture. She stood with her new husband among the hedges she'd once seen as confinement, watching society dance and laugh and live, and felt the weight of invisibility finally lift. "What will you paint next?" the Duke asked quietly. Karen smiled, squeezing his hand. "The truth, always the truth." And in the East Gardens, construction continued on her studio, a space entirely her own, where she would spend the next 40 years painting souls with fierce, loving honesty, never looking away. 6 months of marriage had transformed Ashmont Hall from mausoleum to home. Karen's studio was her sanctuary, half-finished canvases leaning against every wall, brushes soaking in jars, pigments organized in a chaos only she understood. Windows flooded the space with light that changed throughout the day, and she'd learned to paint by each quality: the sharp clarity of morning, the golden warmth of afternoon, the melancholy blue of twilight. She was working on a new series, portraits of overlooked people. Mrs. Hemsworth had been first, but now there were others: the head gardener with soil permanently embedded in his nail beds, the scullery maid who hummed while she worked, the village blacksmith whose hands told stories of craft and labor. Faces society never bothered to see, souls she was determined to make visible. The Duke entered carrying a tea tray, a ritual they'd developed. He'd dismissed the servants for these afternoon hours, time that belonged only to them. "How's your subject?" he asked, setting down the tray. Resistant. Karen smiled, dabbing burnt sienna onto her palette. He insists he's not interesting enough to paint. Wise man. The Duke settled into the chair by the window, pulling out his own sketchbook, a recent addition to their routine. Though his wife seems determined to prove him wrong. Show me today's attempt. He held up the sketch reluctantly. A simple still life. Teacup, book, window light. The proportions were slightly off, the perspective awkward, but there was something honest in the observation. I'm terrible at this, he said. Karen moved behind him, studying the sketch over his shoulder. You're honest at this. That's better. She kissed the top of his head and returned to her canvas, and they worked in comfortable silence, the kind of intimacy that didn't require constant conversation, where presence alone was enough. Later, walking through the conservatory, Karen heard the soft scratch of charcoal on paper. She found the girl tucked behind a potted palm, perhaps 14, wearing a maid's uniform, bent over a makeshift sketchbook of salvaged paper. The girl looked up with pure terror when Karen approached. I'm sorry, Your Grace. I know I shouldn't. I'll stop. I promise. Please don't dismiss me. Show me what you've drawn. The girl's hands trembled as she held out the sketches. They were crude, perspective askew, proportions uncertain, but there was something there, emotional honesty, careful observation, hunger to capture what she saw, a study of light through glass, the head butler's tired expression, the kitchen cat sleeping in a sunbeam. Karen saw herself at 14, sketching in secret, convinced her art was worthless because no one had ever suggested otherwise. What's your name? Alice, Your Grace. Alice? Would you like to learn properly? I could teach you basic technique, how to see light and shadow, composition. The girl's eyes went wide. But I'm just a maid. Art isn't for people like me. Art isn't for nobles or the celebrated, Karen said firmly. It's for anyone who sees truth and needs to express it. That evening, she told the Duke about the discovery. He listened quietly, then smiled, the genuine expression she'd learned to recognize as distinct from his public face. The Ashmont Studio for Young Artists, he said. We'll fund it. Proper instruction for anyone with talent and hunger, regardless of position or circumstance. Karen kissed him. You're going to bankrupt yourself on my projects. I'm going to die happy funding them. The letter arrived on a Thursday in late April, 1896. Karen recognized the handwriting, stilted, careful, unmistakably Karen V's. She opened it with her heart in her throat. Dear Karen, this is my 4th attempt at writing this letter. The others I burned because they were too defensive, too full of justifications you don't need to hear. Your portrait forced me to see what I'd spent years hiding from myself. The fear, the desperate need for validation that made me cruel. I've left London. I'm living quietly in Hampshire, pursuing watercolors. Nothing brilliant, but mine. I don't expect forgiveness. But I wanted you to know that you gave me something by painting me so clearly. Permission to stop pretending. Your stepsister, Karen V. Carr. A second letter had arrived with it. Margaret's handwriting more confident, but the words equally halting. I see now what I destroyed in myself and tried to destroy in you. Forgive me, if you can. Karen sat for a long time, holding both letters. Then she went to her studio and painted a small portrait, Karen V., as a child, perhaps 6 years old, before cruelty had taken root, innocent, still capable of becoming something other than what she'd been. She sent it with a brief note. Forgiveness is a process, but understanding is a start. Summer arrived, and with it the golden light Karen loved best. She found the Duke in their shared studio space one evening, both of them working side by side. He was sketching her as she painted. She was painting him as he sketched. The meta-nature of the moment struck them simultaneously, and they both started laughing. We're ridiculous, Karen said, wiping tears of mirth from her eyes. We're artists, he grinned. It's permitted. Their conversation turned to the future as the light faded to blue. The studio for young artists would open in autumn, perhaps children someday, though they were in no rush. A gallery to showcase overlooked artists, giving platform to voices society ignored. A life built on truth, imperfect and honest, and theirs. Karen looked at him across the fading light. Do you ever regret it, invoking that archaic law, claiming a stranger on impulse? The Duke set down his charcoal, his expression serious. Every day. Her heart dropped until he continued. I regret that I didn't find you sooner, that I wasted years collecting art instead of creating life. That Isabel and I never had what you and I discovered in 6 hours, the ability to see and be seen clearly. Karen crossed to him, taking his hands, both of them stained with charcoal and paint, evidence of their shared passion. Then let's not waste any more time. They returned to their work, two artists crafting something far more valuable than any masterpiece, a marriage built on seeing and being seen, perfect in its imperfection. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.